multiculturalism is one which in Quebec they use a different name, and they use the concept of interculturalism. Instead of saying multiculture, the juxtaposition of many cultures, multiple cultures side by side, they said, no, wait a minute. Cultures are not isolated, containers. So it's more like interculturalism. There is constant interaction between different cultural groups. But there's also some political reasons why they chose to use a different name. The philosophy behind it is what I just said, more exchange between cultural groups, but recognizing that it's within a broader society, and that means that this interculturalism is a better conceptual term to talk about a society where there is constant dialogue between the different minority and majority groups in order to learn how to respect differences. Interculturalism as a political policy has some advantages, such as an increased knowledge about various cultures because there's more interaction. It doesn't think of culture as closed. It promotes the integration of immigrants into the mostly French-speaking society of Quebec. But of course, on the basis of French, the common public language, promoted by the Bill 101, which I mentioned earlier, and in order to participate in a common civic culture. Now, there's a sense of here the notion of citizenship that comes along as being important. There's a frame of reference. It's not interaction between minority and majority just for fun. It's in order for minority groups, especially more recent immigrant communities, to be able to acculturate themselves in the civic majority culture of the province, which itself is part of a broader civic Canadian culture too. Finally, and the last 2 points, is that, and this is very important, because for many French Canadians in Quebec, the feeling was that multiculturalism made French culture just one cultural group among many groups, Chinese, Vietnamese, Greek, etc., etc. And French Canadians felt that that was unfair, have felt. I grew up in a family that very much taught me that this was indeed part of the problem. Because a lot of French Canadians in Quebec think of the French Canadians as a single and distinct nation within the Canadian nation. So that's the challenge. I will come back in a few moments. And finally, one of the political policy of interculturalism was, instead of promoting funding to separate cultural organizations, it encouraged and put more funds into what is called in French Maison de la Culture, which is a house of culture in a broad sense. Note that they don't put it in the plural, they put it in the singular, whereby different people from different origins can mingle and learn from each other. So the emphasis is on the interaction, not on the necessarily continuation or preservations of specificities of different cultural groups.
تحدث عن نقد التعددية وبدلا من القول الثقافات المتعددة، فالثقافات ليست وحدات منفصلة الواحدة عن الأخرى. وظهر يعني مصطلح جديد في مقاطعة الكوبك، وسبب ظهور هذا المصطلح الجديد هو سبب سياسي. فبدلا من القول بالتعددية الثقافية، التفاعل بين الثقافات، وهناك مثلا التفاعل بين الثقافات Interculturalism تدعو إلى زيادة المعرفة بالثقافة الأخرى، تشجيع المهاجرين للعيش في ثقافة اللغة الفرنسية، والمساهمة في المواطنة، وليس فقط تفاعل بين أقلية وأغلبية، ولكن على القدرة على الاندماج في التعدد وفي المجتمع. وفي التعددية الثقافية أيضا جعلت الثقافة الفرنسية مجرد واحدة من ثقافات كثيرة. فبينما يعني أهل كوبك يفكرون بكوبك الفرنسية أو كيان مستقل وغير ذلك، وبدلا من تخصيص أموال وتمويل لعديد من الثقافات، ولكن تخصيص أموال للتفاعل بين الثقافات والاندماج بين الثقافات.
So, what are today some of the critiques of multiculturalism and to some degree also of interculturalism? And this is where we get into the contemporary scene in Canada. Many people, especially after 9/11, especially with the pressures of globalizations, say that the national unity of Canada is under threat by this politics of multiculturalism. For example, one recent survey done by University of Toronto this year found out that there's a number of different immigrants who are, in fact, not identifying themselves very strongly at all as Canadians, and yet they benefit and they participate in the Canadian reality. Some say that it reduces Quebecers to just another minority group, which I explained earlier. Others will say that, in fact, multiculturalism slows down the process of integration and assimilation. Those are, of course, the people who prefer an assimilation approach to the process of integrating the immigrants versus an acculturation, assimilation being more imposed. The immigrants choose to come to Canada, so they must become Canadian and do like us. Acculturation is that they choose to come to Canada, but they then decide which part of the Canadian social behavior they will do and which part that they are allowed to do but is not majority behavior, they will continue from their own ethnic, religious background, etc. So some people argue that multiculturalism avoids the important role which racism plays in preventing the multiculturalism vision to materialize. It's either individual or institutional racism in particular. I will come back to that if you want to. It's complex to explain at the moment. Some would say that multiculturalism promotes a static and limited notion of culture as fragmented and confined to ethnicity, so that it's reductive of the complexity of identities and the ways in which those identities are often constructed by our human perceptions of histories, and that they are often, in fact, very fluid and changing over time. Then others say that that multiculturalism is blind to institutional forms of racial discrimination, focusing too much on individual expressions and experiences rather than collective ones. Finally, coming from feminist perspectives, some would say that the multiculturalism tends to reproduce cultural patterns of patriarchal domination against women, and that also is not helpful for integration of women in the notion of equality between men and women, which is a value of the majority of Canadians. And the last one is that that multiculturalism can actually promote cultural relativism, which for many religious people in particular is a threat, meaning that they have a strong commitment to a sense of truth, and that multiculturalism for them, in fact, only ends up undermining that sense of truth, especially if it gets reflected in the educational public system where their children will go and study.
التعددية الثقافية في كندا وخاصة بعد 11 من سبتمبر وضغوط العولمة قيل أنها تهدد وحدة كندا، وهناك استطلاع للرأي قامت به جامعة تورنتو عن انتماء المواطنين لكندا، أظهرت نسبة قليلة، وأهل كوبيك يعني يشعرون بأن التعددية الثقافية تجعلهم مجرد أقلية بين أقليات كثيرة، ومن انتقادات موجهة للتعددية أنها تبطئ الاندماج والاختلاط، وأن المهاجرين الجدد يقررون المجتمع الذي ينتسبون إليه، ويعني بدل أن ينضموا إلى المجتمع الأكبر أو إلى أن يصبحوا كنديين ينتقون الأماكن التي أو المناطق التي ينتمون إليها، وأن التعددية تشجع مفهوم الجمود والمفهوم الوحدود للثقافة، وكذلك التعددية الثقافية لا تهتم بالتفاعل